She stepped off the soot-stained Union Pacific train with a heart full of hope, only to be looked up and down like a defective piece of livestock. For a woman in the unforgiving West of 1878, a broken marriage contract didn't just mean a broken heart, it meant starvation. Humiliated in front of the entire town because she was deemed too large and unladylike by the merchant who paid her fare, her fate seemed sealed. But the townsfolk laughing at her didn't notice the towering, broad-shouldered shadow stepping out of the mercantile. He wasn't looking for a fragile porcelain doll. He needed a survivor. The air in Oak Haven, Colorado territory tasted of pulverized rock, pine sap, and the bitter tang of coal smoke. For 26-year-old Matilda Jenkins, it tasted like salvation, or so she had prayed for the last 14 days. Matilda was not a woman who inspired poetry in the parlor rooms of Philadelphia, where other women possessed waspish waists and delicate, sloping shoulders. Matilda was built like the oak trees her new home was named after. She stood nearly 5 feet 10 inches tall, with broad shoulders, sturdy hips, and hands that were entirely too capable. She had spent her youth hauling coal scuttles, wrestling with heavy cast-iron laundry pots, and caring for an ailing, destitute father. When he finally passed, leaving her with nothing but a mountain of debts and a tiny, seemingly worthless patch of marshland on the outskirts of the city, she realized the civilized East had no place for a woman of her stature and empty purse. Desperation had driven her to the Western Settlement's matrimonial charter of 1876. She had corresponded for 6 months with Mr. Jeremiah Cobb, a local proprietor in Oak Haven. His letters were brief, pragmatic, and promised a stable home above his dry goods store. In return, she would be his wife, keep his ledgers, and tend to his domestic needs. Clutching her worn canvas satchel, Matilda smoothed the front of her gray wool traveling dress. It was tight across her broad chest and shoulders, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. As the steam from the locomotive hissed and cleared, she scanned the wooden platform. Men in dusty bowler hats and canvas trousers moved about, but one man stood near the station master's office, checking a pocket watch with frantic, bird-like movements. He matched the tintype she carried, thin, impeccably groomed, with a sharp, calculating jawline and a neat mustache. "Mr. Cobb?" Matilda approached, her voice steady, despite the frantic fluttering in her stomach. Jeremiah Cobb snapped his pocket watch shut and turned. His eyes, small and cold like polished stones, darted from her face, down to her sensible, heavy-soled boots, and back up again. The polite, business-like smile he had worn for the arriving passengers instantly vanished, replaced by a look of profound offense. "You are Matilda Jenkins?" His voice carried a reedy, nasal pitch that cut through the noise of the platform. "I am, sir. It is a pleasure to finally make your acquaintance." She extended a strong, ungloved hand. Cobb did not take it. Instead, he took a step back, his face flushing with indignation. "This is some sort of trick. A swindle," he barked, his voice drawing the attention of the loitering baggage handlers and waiting passengers. "I beg your pardon?" Matilda felt the blood drain from her face. The agency described a young woman of respectable bearing and pleasant proportions, Cobb sneered, gesturing vaguely at her. "Look at you. You are an ox of a woman. I ordered a wife to grace the counter of my store, a lady of delicate constitution to refine my establishment. Not a plow horse." A few men standing near the telegraph office chuckled. Matilda felt a hot, prickling wave of shame wash over her. "Mr. Cobb, please. We have a legal correspondence. You paid my fare on the condition." "I paid $50 for a bride, not a stevedore," Cobb interrupted, his voice rising to ensure everyone on the platform heard his righteous anger. "I am refusing the contract. As of this moment, the agreement is null and void." The matrimonial charter explicitly states that gross misrepresentation is grounds for termination. "I sent you a photograph," Matilda protested, her voice cracking as the devastating reality of her situation began to set in. "A tintype of your face, madam, cleverly cropped to hide the sheer bulk of you. I will not have it. You are entirely unsuitable. I expect you to reimburse my $50, or I will have the sheriff arrest you for defrauding a businessman." "I have nothing," Matilda whispered, the harsh Colorado wind suddenly biting through her coat. "I have $2 to my name. You cannot simply abandon me here. I have nowhere to go." That sounds like a personal misfortune. Cobb adjusted his lapels, turning his back on her. "Perhaps the local blacksmith is looking for an apprentice. Good day to you, Miss Jenkins." He walked away, leaving Matilda standing alone on the dusty platform. The chuckles of the bystanders grew louder, turning into outright laughter. She was 26, utterly alone, thousands of miles from anything familiar, and facing debtor's prison in a town that had just watched her be discarded like spoiled meat. She squeezed her eyes shut, refusing to let the tears fall, her large hands curling into tight, helpless fists. Across the street, leaning casually against the rough-hewn timber pillar of the town's only saloon, a man watched the spectacle unfold. Gideon Reed did not frequent Oakhaven often. He came down from his high-altitude claim in the Bitterroot Range only twice a year to trade pelts, buy salt, black powder, and coffee. Gideon was a man carved from the very granite of the mountains he called home. He stood a terrifying 6 feet 5 inches, wrapped in a heavy coat of cured wolf hide, his face obscured by a thick, dark beard and the wide brim of a battered felt hat. He was a man of terrifying silence and brutal efficiency, entirely detached from the social squabbles of town life. But as he watched Jeremiah Cobb humiliate the tall woman on the platform, a low, dangerous rumble vibrated in Gideon's chest. Gideon knew Cobb. The man was a notoriously cheap, opportunistic weasel who watered down his kerosene and shorted the scales on flour. But Gideon's focus was not on the weasel, it was on the woman. From across the dusty thoroughfare, Gideon studied Matilda. He saw the townsfolk laughing at her height and her sturdy build. Idiots, the lot of them. Out here, a delicate flower wilted in the first frost. A lady of pleasant proportions would snap under the weight of a water bucket or freeze to death when the cabin fire went out. Gideon didn't see a plow horse. He saw survival. He saw a woman whose broad shoulders could swing an axe alongside him. He saw hips built to bear children who would actually survive the harsh winters. He saw resilience in the way she kept her back straight and her chin up, refusing to weep in front of the men mocking her. He had been considering finding a wife for 3 years. The isolation of the Bitterroots was maddening, and the labor required to maintain his growing homestead was becoming too much for one man. But the prospect of dealing with a fragile, weeping city girl had kept him solitary. Until now. Gideon pushed himself off the wooden pillar. His heavy, moccasin-clad feet made almost no sound as he crossed the muddy street. Matilda was kneeling on the platform, trying to gather the few belongings that had spilled from her worn satchel when a baggage handler carelessly kicked it aside. She reached for a tin hairbrush, but a massive shadow fell over her, blocking out the afternoon sun. She looked up, freezing in terror. Standing over her was a giant of a man, smelling of pine needles, wood smoke, and wild earth. He held out a hand the size of a dinner plate, calloused and scarred. "Leave it," a voice rumbled, deep and resonant, like stones grinding in a riverbed. Matilda blinked, hesitant, before placing her large hand in his. He pulled her to her feet with shocking ease, as if she weighed no more than a child. Gideon did not let go of her hand. Instead, he turned his imposing frame toward the mercantile where Jeremiah Cobb was gloating to a patron on his porch. Gideon marched across the street, dragging Matilda gently but firmly behind him. The laughter on the street died instantly. Townspeople stepped back, giving the mountain man a wide berth. Gideon stopped at the base of the mercantile steps. He reached into his heavy leather pouch, withdrew a velvet bag, and tossed it onto the wooden planks at Cobb's feet. It landed with a heavy, metallic clink. 3 one-ounce gold nuggets, Gideon said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden, terrified silence of the street. Worth $60 at the assayer's office. Cobb stared at the pouch, then up at the terrifying mountain man. R. Reed. What is the meaning of this? $50 to buy out her travel debt and contract, Gideon stated, his dark eyes locked on the merchant. The extra 10 is for you to keep your mouth shut about this woman ever again. If I hear a whisper of disrespect toward her from you, I will come back down that mountain and pull your store down around your ears. Are we clear? Cobb swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically. He scooped up the pouch. "The contract is yours, Reed. Good riddance to the both of you." Gideon turned to Matilda. Her eyes were wide, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She had just been traded from a merchant to a barbarian. "What is your name?" Gideon asked, his tone softening only a fraction. "Matilda. Matilda Jenkins. Matilda. 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 "I am Gideon Reed. I have a homestead 3 days' ride up the Bitterroot. It is hard country. The winters are brutal, the work is endless, and the nearest neighbor is 20 miles away." He looked her directly in the eyes. "I do not want a delicate wife, Matilda Jenkins. I want a partner who will not die on me when the snow falls. Will you come with me?" Matilda looked at the mercantile, at the sneering face of Jeremiah Cobb, at the dusty, judgmental town, and then back up at the towering man before her. He was frightening, yes, but his eyes were honest, and he had not looked at her with disgust. He looked at her as if she had value. "Do I have a choice, Mr. Reed?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You always have a choice," Gideon replied. "I bought your debt. I did not buy you. If you wish to stay here and seek employment, I will tear up the contract, and you owe me nothing. But I am offering you a home." Matilda took a deep breath, her broad chest expanding. She tightened her grip on her canvas satchel. "Then I suppose we have a long ride ahead of us, Mr. Reed." The journey into the Bitterroot Range was a brutal shock to Matilda's system. They rode in silence for the first 2 days, navigating narrow trails that clung precariously to the sides of sheer granite cliffs. Gideon rode a massive black draft cross, leading a pack mule heavily laden with the winter's supplies. Matilda was mounted on a sturdy roan mare that Gideon assured her was sure-footed, though her terror at the plunging drop-offs made her grip the saddle horn until her knuckles turned white. Despite her fear, the mountain air was a revelation. It was crisp, thin, and smelled of ancient spruce and melting snow. As they climbed higher, leaving the dusty plains far below, the oppressive humidity of her past life seemed to evaporate. Gideon was a man of few words, but Matilda noticed his actions. When they made camp, he didn't order her to cook or clean. He set up the canvas tent, built the fire with striking efficiency, and handed her a tin plate of salted pork and beans before he served himself. He treated her not as a servant, but as a capable member of his expedition. "You have strong hands," Gideon remarked suddenly on the second night, staring at her across the crackling campfire. Matilda felt a flush creep up her neck. She habitually tried to hide her large hands in the folds of her skirt. "They are ugly, not a lady's hands." "A lady's hands would be blistered and bleeding by now from gripping those reins," Gideon said matter-of-factly, taking a sip of his bitter black coffee. "Out here, pretty things die fast. Useful things endure." It was the closest thing to a compliment she had ever received. But the mountain's beauty masked its lethal temper. On the afternoon of the third day, as they approached the timberline where Gideon's cabin sat, the sky abruptly bruised purple. The temperature plummeted within minutes, and a violent sleet storm descended upon them, turning the narrow dirt switchbacks into slick, treacherous mud. "Dismount!" Gideon shouted over the howling wind, sliding off his horse. "Lead them! The trail is too slick to ride." Matilda scrambled off the roan, her heavy boots sinking into the freezing mud. She grabbed the reins, pulling the horse forward as the sleet pelted her face like shattered glass. Ahead of her, Gideon was wrestling with the pack mule. The beast, terrified by the sudden storm and the slick footing, balked. With a sickening crack, the ledge beneath the mule's hind hooves gave way. The mule let out a terrified bray as its back half plunged over the edge of the ravine. Gideon lunged, wrapping his massive arms around the mule's neck, digging his boots into the mud to keep the animal and their entire winter supply of flour, coffee, and salt from falling into the abyss. "Hold!" Gideon roared, the cords in his neck straining as the mud beneath his own boots began to slide. The weight was too much, even for a man of his size. Matilda didn't think. The civilized panic of a city girl vanished, replaced by the deep-seated muscle memory of a woman who had spent a lifetime lifting dead weight. She dropped the reins of her horse, sprinted forward, and threw herself to the ground beside Gideon. She grabbed the leather breeching strap of the mule's harness with both hands. "Pull!" she screamed over the wind. Gideon shot her a shocked glance, but the slipping earth allowed no time for argument. Together, they strained. Matilda felt the muscles in her broad back and thick shoulders scream in agony. The rough leather tore at her palms, but she dug her heels into a solid root and hauled with every ounce of strength her large frame possessed. Slowly, agonizingly, the mule's scrambling front hooves found purchase. With one final massive heave from both Gideon and Matilda, the animal surged forward, collapsing safely onto the muddy trail. Matilda fell onto her back in the mud, chest heaving, rain and sleet washing over her face. She looked at her raw, bleeding hands, expecting the familiar wave of shame for being so unladylike. Instead, a shadow blocked the rain. Gideon was kneeling over her. He reached down, gently taking her bleeding hands in his. He didn't look at her with the pity or disgust she was used to. His dark eyes were blazing with profound respect. "You," Gideon breathed, his voice thick with emotion he rarely showed, "are a magnificent creature, Matilda Jenkins." Far below them, in the town of Oakhaven, the sleet was merely a cold rain. Inside the dry goods store, Jeremiah Cobb was not thinking about the storm. He was sitting at his desk, staring at a crumpled piece of parchment he had found tucked inside the lining of Matilda's forgotten, busted trunk at the train depot. It was a legal correspondence from a Philadelphia solicitor. It detailed that the worthless marshland Matilda had inherited from her father had just been surveyed by the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. They required the land to connect their new Eastern Seaboard line. The letter contained a buyout offer for the land, $10,000. Jeremiah Cobb's cold eyes widened with greedy realization. He hadn't just thrown away a clumsy woman, he had thrown away an heiress. He quickly checked the date on the matrimonial contract he had so foolishly sold to Gideon Reed. By law, if he could prove he was coerced into selling the contract, or if he could retrieve her before the marriage was consummated by a magistrate, the money could legally fall under his control. Cobb slammed his fist on the desk. He needed men. Men with guns who weren't afraid of the cold, and who weren't afraid of a mountain man. He was going to get his bride back. The cabin sat on a high, timbered ridge, an imposing structure of massive, hand-hewn ponderosa pine logs locked tightly together with dovetailed notches and chinked with a mixture of river mud and dry prairie grass. It was not a delicate home. It was a fortress built to withstand the crushing weight of Rocky Mountain snows and the howling, razor-sharp winds that tore through the canyons. For Matilda, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Life on the mountain was an immediate, brutal education in survival. There were no leisurely afternoons, no parlor visits, and certainly no time for fragile sensibilities. Yet, for the first time in her 26 years, Matilda felt a profound sense of belonging. Her size, long treated as a grotesque abnormality in the cramped, judgmental streets of Philadelphia, was suddenly her greatest asset. When Gideon hauled a massive, lifeless bull elk into the clearing behind the cabin, he didn't expect her to turn away in delicate horror. He handed her a skinning knife with a handle made of polished elk horn. "The hide goes on the stretching rack. The meat gets salted and smoked," he instructed, his voice low and steady. He watched her for a moment, anticipating the usual swooning or complaints he had seen in the few women who ventured this high. Matilda simply rolled up the sleeves of her worn wool dress, exposing thick, capable forearms, and nodded. "Show me where to start." Over the next 3 weeks, the rhythm of the mountain consumed them. Matilda wielded a heavy, double-bitted axe with a fluid, devastating power, splitting thick rounds of lodgepole pine into firewood with a sharp, rhythmic thwack that echoed through the valley. She hauled buckets of icy water from the spring, her broad shoulders bearing the weight without a single tremble. She learned to load and fire Gideon's heavy Winchester model, 1,873 repeating rifle. the recoil bruising her shoulder, though she never once complained of the pain. And Gideon watched her. The silent, solitary mountain man found his eyes constantly drawn to the sheer, unapologetic power of her. In the evenings, illuminated by the warm amber glow of a coal oil lamp and the roaring hearth, he studied the way the firelight caught the stray strands of her dark hair. He noticed the raw, healing blisters on her large hands, and for the first time in his hard life, he felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to protect someone. "You work harder than any 3 men I've known," Gideon said one evening, breaking the long silence as he oiled his Colt revolver at the heavy oak table. Matilda looked up from the heavy canvas trousers she was patching. She instinctively tried to tuck her large hands under the fabric. "It is the only way I know how to be of use. I am not." "I am not built for decoration, Mr. Reed." Gideon set the revolver down. He stood, his massive frame casting a long shadow against the log wall, and crossed the small room. He knelt before her chair, reaching out to gently pull her hands from beneath the canvas. He turned them over, tracing the calluses and the fading scars from the mule harness incident with a surprising, reverent tenderness. "Down in those towns, they build houses out of thin, painted wood that rots in a few years," Gideon rumbled, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Up here, we build out of bedrock and old iron. You are not a decoration, Matilda. You are a foundation. And I have never seen a woman more beautiful." Matilda's breath hitched in her chest. The sincerity in his deep voice dismantled decades of mockery and shame in a single heartbeat. She didn't weep, for the mountain had already hardened her tears, but she squeezed his massive hands in return, a silent, ironclad vow of loyalty passing between them. 50 miles below, in the soot-choked town of Oakhaven, loyalty was being bought with paper money and bad whiskey. Jeremiah Cobb sat in the dim, smoky back room of the Golden Spur Saloon, sliding a stack of greenbacks across a grease-stained table. Across from him sat Garrett Hayes, a former Pinkerton enforcer who had been dismissed for excessive cruelty during the railroad strikes in Denver City. Hayes was a coiled spring of a man, lean and vicious, with a face heavily scarred by a shattered whiskey bottle and 2 ivory-handled revolvers resting casually on his hips. "The woman is an heiress," Cobb whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of greed and fear. "Her father left her a strip of marshland in Pennsylvania that the railroad needs. I have the solicitor's letter. They are offering $10,000. She is legally contracted to me, Hayes. That mountain savage, Reed, he stole her right off the platform." Hayes took a slow drag from a thin cigar, the cherry glowing fiercely in the dim light. He exhaled a thick cloud of blue smoke. "Gideon Reed ain't a man to trifle with, Cobb. He cracked a man's skull in Leadville 2 years ago just for whipping a horse too hard. He's built like a grizzly, and he shoots like the devil himself." "That is why I am hiring you and your men," Cobb hissed, wiping a line of nervous sweat from his upper lip. "Reed doesn't know about the money. Neither does she. If we ride up there, tell her Reed is holding her for ransom, we can create confusion. You kill Reed, bring the girl back to me, and I will give you $2,000 of the railroad money. Cash." Hayes's cold, dead eyes locked onto the merchant. $2,000 was enough to buy a ranch in Texas and leave the freezing Colorado territories forever. He slowly scooped the advance money off the table and shoved it into his long canvas duster. "Gather the boys," Hayes said, checking the cylinder of his Colt. "We ride at first light. We'll hit them just as the first snow traps them in." Back on the ridge, the sky had turned the color of bruised iron. The wind shifted, bringing with it the sharp, metallic scent of an impending blizzard. The gathering storm was coming, and with it a reckoning that would test whether the bond forged in the harsh mountain air was strong enough to withstand the greed of civilized men. The storm hit with a ferocity that shook the massive logs of the cabin. For 2 days, the world outside was reduced to a howling, impenetrable wall of white. Inside, the heavy iron stove radiated a fierce heat, keeping the deadly cold at bay. Matilda and Gideon had fallen into a comfortable, deeply intimate rhythm, isolated from the rest of humanity. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind abruptly died. The silence that followed was deafening, absolute, and deeply unnatural. Gideon was by the window, packing tobacco into his pipe, when he suddenly froze. His posture shifted, the relaxed mountain man instantly vanishing, replaced by a coiled, lethal predator. He set the pipe down and reached for the Winchester resting by the door. "What is it?" Matilda asked, stepping away from the dough she was kneading on the table. "Horses," Gideon whispered, peering through a small crack in the heavy wooden shutters. 4 of them, plunging through the drifts at the edge of the tree line. Matilda wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron, her heart hammering against her ribs. She moved to the secondary window, carefully peering out. Emerging from the snowy pines were 4 men, their horses exhausted and heavily lathered, despite the freezing temperature. Leading them was a man in a long canvas duster, holding a rifle across his saddle horn. Behind him, looking pale, frozen, and terrified, was Jeremiah Cobb. "Gideon Reed!" A harsh, carrying voice echoed across the snow-muffled clearing. Garrett Hayes spurred his horse a few paces forward. "We know you're in there! Step out with your hands empty! We've come for the woman you stole!" Gideon pulled the hammer back on the Winchester. The loud clack-clack sounded like a thunderclap in the small cabin. He looked at Matilda. "Stay away from the windows." "I am not a child to hide under a bed," Matilda said, her voice dropping an octave, finding a terrifying, resonant calm. She walked over to the hearth and picked up a heavy, double-barreled shotgun Gideon used for bird hunting. She broke the action, efficiently sliding 2 heavy brass buckshot shells into the chambers, and snapped it shut with a sharp flick of her thick wrists. Gideon's lips twitched into a grim, deeply affectionate smile. He kicked the heavy oak door open just wide enough to stand in the frame, his rifle leveled at Hayes's chest. "You are trespassing on my claim, Hayes." Gideon's voice boomed over the snow, rolling like distant thunder. "Turn those horses around. Now." "You're holding legally contracted property, Reed," Cobb yelled, his voice cracking with anxiety as he peered from behind Hayes's horse. "She belongs to me, and I know why you took her." "You read the letter in her trunk, didn't you? You're just waiting to claim her railroad money." Inside the cabin, Matilda froze. "Railroad money?" Cobb waved a crumpled piece of parchment in the freezing air. $10,000. That's what her father's worthless marshland is worth. "He doesn't want you, Matilda. You're a monstrosity. He just wants the money." The words hung in the biting air, poisonous and heavy. Cobb was a master of exploiting insecurities, aiming his venom directly at the deep-seated wounds Matilda had carried her entire life. He expected her to shatter, to run out crying, realizing that the mountain man's kindness was just a cruel financial calculation. Gideon didn't flinch. He didn't even look back at the cabin. He kept his sights dead on Hayes. "I don't know what paper you're waving, Cobb, and I don't care. I bought her contract for $60 in gold to get her away from a worm like you. She is a free woman. And if she wants you dead, I will shoot you where you sit." Matilda stepped into the doorway, standing shoulder to shoulder with Gideon. The light caught the barrel of the shotgun in her massive hands. She looked at Cobb, and the merchant instinctively recoiled in his saddle. She wasn't the humiliated, trembling woman on the train platform anymore. She was a woman of the Bitterroots. "You left my trunk at the depot, Mr. Cobb," Matilda's voice rang out, clear and powerful, devoid of any doubt. "Gideon never saw it. You are a liar, a coward, and a thief. And you are not welcome at my home." Hayes spat into the snow. "Enough talking. Take them!" He leveled his rifle, but Gideon was faster. The Winchester roared, and Hayes's horse reared violently as a bullet shattered the wooden stock of the mercenary's rifle, sending splinters flying into his face. Chaos erupted. The other 2 hired guns drew their revolvers, firing wildly at the cabin. Bullets tore into the thick pine logs with heavy, dull thuds, sending showers of bark into the air. Gideon pushed Matilda back inside, slamming the heavy door shut and dropping the iron crossbar into place. "Cover the back!" Gideon shouted, moving to the front window and returning fire through the narrow slit. Matilda didn't hesitate. She ran to the rear of the cabin, pressing her back against the wall near the small, heavy-shuttered window that faced the woodpile. She could hear the crunch of boots on the snow. Someone was trying to flank them. Suddenly, the shutter was violently pried open with a crowbar. A bearded face, contorted in anger, appeared in the frame, a revolver thrusting through the opening. Matilda didn't aim the shotgun. She didn't have room. Instead, relying on the sheer, terrifying strength that had spent years wrestling cast iron stoves and hauling coal, she dropped the gun, stepped forward, and grabbed the barrel of the man's revolver with her bare left hand, pushing it upward just as it fired. The bullet buried itself into the ceiling beams. With her right hand, she seized the man by the heavy lapels of his wool coat. She braced her thick legs, let out a guttural yell of pure exertion, and hauled him entirely through the window. The man weighed over 200 pounds, but Matilda ripped him through the narrow frame as if he were made of rags. He crashed onto the hard wooden floor of the cabin. Before he could recover his breath, Matilda drove the heavy, iron-shod heel of her boot directly into his jaw. His eyes rolled back, and he went entirely limp. At the front of the cabin, the gunfire abruptly ceased. "Matilda!" Gideon yelled, his voice laced with sudden panic. "I am fine," she called back, her chest heaving, adrenaline surging through her veins like liquid fire. "The back is secure." Gideon looked at the unconscious thug on the floor, then at the massive woman standing over him. The profound respect in his eyes deepened into absolute awe. He turned back to the window. Outside, the situation had rapidly deteriorated for the attackers. Hayes was clutching a bloody, splinter-filled cheek, trying to control his panicked horse. The third gunman, seeing his companion dragged bodily through a window by a woman, had lost his nerve entirely and was frantically spurring his horse back down the trail. Gideon threw the door open and stepped out onto the porch, the Winchester pressed tight to his shoulder. "Drop it, Hayes," Gideon commanded. Hayes looked at his shattered rifle, then at the towering, wrathful mountain man, and finally at the imposing silhouette of Matilda stepping out behind him, holding the heavy shotgun. The mercenary slowly raised his hands. "We're done, Reed. It ain't worth dying over." "Ride," Gideon said simply. "If I ever see your face in this territory again, I won't aim for the stock of your rifle." Hayes didn't need to be told twice. He wheeled his horse around and spurred it hard into the snow, abandoning his employer without a second glance. Jeremiah Cobb was left alone. His horse, spooked by the gunfire, had bucked him into a deep snowdrift. He scrambled frantically backward, his expensive bowler hat lost in the snow, as Gideon and Matilda walked slowly down the porch steps toward him. Gideon stopped a few feet away, towering over the terrified merchant like an ancient god of the mountain. He reached out and snatched the crumpled parchment from Cobb's trembling hand. He glanced at it, confirming the Pennsylvania solicitor's seal, and then handed it to Matilda. "I didn't know," Gideon said softly to her, ignoring Cobb entirely. "I know," Matilda replied, her eyes locked on Gideon's. "And even if you did, it wouldn't matter. This paper didn't pull me out of the mud. You did." She turned her gaze down to Cobb. The merchant was weeping, babbling apologies and excuses. Matilda felt no anger, only a profound, dismissive pity. He was a small, weak man, entirely out of his depth in a world built for giants. "Mr. Cobb," Matilda said, her voice echoing with the icy authority of the winter wind. "You are going to walk down this mountain. If you survive, you will go to the magistrate in Oakhaven. You will sign a full, legal relinquishment of any matrimonial contract, debt, or claim against me. If you do not, or if you ever breathe my name again, Gideon will not come for you." She stepped closer, her broad shadow swallowing him entirely. "I will." Cobb nodded frantically, scrambling to his feet and backing away, slipping and stumbling through the knee-deep snow until he turned and ran, a pathetic, fleeing speck against the vast white wilderness. The silence of the mountain returned, heavy and peaceful. Matilda looked at the paper in her hand. $10,000. It was a fortune beyond comprehension. It could buy a mansion in Denver, silk dresses, a carriage. It could buy a return ticket to the civilized world that had rejected her. She looked up at the crude, massive log cabin, at the frozen pines, and finally at the giant of a man standing beside her, smelling of black powder and pine sap. He was watching her carefully, a question lingering in his dark eyes. "What will you do now?" Gideon asked, his voice rough. "You have the means to go anywhere, to be a lady of society." Matilda laughed, a rich, booming sound that echoed beautifully off the canyon walls. Without hesitation, she ripped the solicitor's letter in half, then into quarters, letting the pieces flutter to the snow at their feet. "I am already exactly where I belong," she said, stepping into his space. "Though, I suppose we could send a wire to the railroad. $10,000 buys a lot of prime cattle, Mr. Reed. We could expand the homestead, build a barn." Gideon dropped his rifle into the snow. He reached out with both massive, scarred hands, pulling her broad shoulders against his chest. It was like two ancient oak trees finally leaning into one another, finding support, strength, and roots that ran deep into the bedrock. "We'll need a bigger cabin, Mrs. Reed," Gideon whispered into her hair, his rough lips pressing against her temple. "For the children." Matilda wrapped her powerful arms around his waist, holding him with a fierce, unbreakable grip. "Then we had better get to work." If you found your heart racing alongside Matilda and Gideon as they fought for their love and their lives in the unforgiving Rockies, this is just the beginning of the journey. True strength isn't about fitting into society's narrow mold. It's about finding the one person who sees your power as your greatest beauty. If you love this tale of grit, survival, and a romance built on solid bedrock, please hit that like button to support our storytelling. Don't forget to share this video with fellow lovers of dramatic Wild West sagas, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, pulse-pounding historical romances. Drop a comment below. What would you have done with the $10,000? Would you stay on the mountain or head to the city? Let us know, and ring that notification bell so you never miss our next epic frontier adventure.